You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Let me just go back for a moment before we fast forward to the present. You know, if we were meeting on May 9th, 1945 at Temple Sholom in Greenwich, Connecticut, I'm not sure on May 9th, 1945 we would have been meeting in Temple Sholom in Greenwich, Connecticut, but that's a different story. What would the tenor of the discourse have been? Well, to be sure, there would have been celebration that the day before, May 8th, 1945, at great cost to the Allied nations, we had vanquished the Third Reich, whose leader had pledged to the world a 1,000-year reign, and who in the course of 12 years from 1933 to 1945 managed to plant the seeds of destruction for some 60 million people, including, of course, 2/3 of European Jewry. So after celebrating the extraordinary victory in Europe of the Allied forces, including, I might add, more than 500,000 American Jewish servicemen, we would then have turned to the other side of the ledger and asked ourselves, perhaps, how can we go on? Look at the world that emerged in the days and weeks after May 8th. We came slowly to the realization of what had happened, frankly beyond the capacity for imagination of just about anyone who had not been present, either as survivor or as inmate or as liberator. We had witnessed the destruction of European Jewry as it was known, including the centers of Jewish study and learning and life from Vilna to Thessaloniki. The survivors, those few who were able to emerge from Auschwitz and Birkenau, from Dachau and Treblinka, began to make their way home as best they could. But when home was places like Kielce or Krakow, not only were they not welcome, but as Jan Gross, professor at Princeton University, wrote in his book, Fear, they were the victims of new pogroms by their neighbors who did not want them back and did not want them to regain their property or any other semblance of their pre-war life. What did those survivors end up doing? They ended up, in many cases, returning to Germany and Austria in order to find a temporary home in displaced persons camps, in places like Bergen-Belsen, no less. And I met at least one person here in the audience this evening who was born in such a DP camp. Even after the war, they couldn't find refuge in places like the United States, with few exceptions. And those who sought to make it to mandatory Palestine too often found themselves behind barbed wire on the island of Cyprus. And as the dawning of this new alphabet of genocide that had been created for us, from the letter A for Auschwitz to the letter Z for Zyklon B, began to dawn, wouldn't it have been a reasonable assumption at gatherings like this to ask the question of our rabbi, why continue this journey? It's proved too costly. And yet, groups like those assembled here nonetheless found the faith and the fortitude to put one step in front of the other and begin to rebuild. And not just physically rebuild in Europe, and not just eventually build a remarkable state in Israel, but rebuild a sense of hope and belief in mankind. Well, we've come a long way. And I remind us of those days because when we face challenging moments like we do now, which to be sure are different but nonetheless daunting, let's remind ourselves that we were not born yesterday. We're not pushovers. We're not ready to fold. We're smart. We have belief. We even have some friends. And one of those friends, by the way, who's here this evening, and someone that I wish all of you to know, is the Consul General of the Czech Republic, who came specially from New York. And I want to tell you, and I would tell you the same thing if she were not here, that ounce for ounce, pound for pound today, Israel does not have a better friend than the Czech Republic, one of the first countries where is Lisveta? Where is she? And I'll come back to it, but a week from today, just a few miles from here, on 43rd Street and 1st Avenue, the UN will mark the 10th anniversary of the Durban Conference. Ring a bell? That infamous anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic hate fest. And when that happens, the Czech Republic will not be there, because the government of the Czech Republic said no, no. And I want to tell you that we better understand and remember our friends. So any of you who are planning vacations, I can tell you a few countries that I suggest you skip. But I'd also encourage a few countries that you ought to visit as a sign of our appreciation and friendship for people who've stood with us at our times of need. So we found our footing and our fortitude, and we found even our friends. And so you fast forward from the days of May 1945 to September 2011. And as the old saying goes, we've come a long way, baby. Well, for one thing, we have a state of Israel. You know, if you stop to think about it, perhaps the most remarkable period of 1,000 days in the history of the Jewish people occurred between May 8th, 1945 and May 14th, 1948. Think about it for just a moment. From the lowest point in Jewish history, within 3 short years, to the realization of the return of the Jewish people to sovereignty in the ancestral homeland. And you know, it wasn't just that the Jewish people returned despite all the obstacles of the British camps in Cyprus and the blockades and all the rest. They came to build, and build they did. They had to defend along with their building, and defend they did. We were never really known as a martial people, were we? And yet, there we were, able to defend a country while building it and cherishing every last acre of that tiny sliver of land, no bigger than the size of New Jersey. And not only did Israel emerge and prosper and grow and ingather the exiles, and contribute to advancing the frontiers of human civilization for all. But American Jews, that other great center of world Jewry, came to realize that though safe in this land, even during the war years, we had been politically impotent. An administration that we viewed iconically and that we had overwhelmingly supported 4 separate times in 1932, 36, 40, and 44. An administration which had done so much to pull this country out of its depression, and so much to prepare a reluctant nation for the inevitable war that we would face and fight with valor, was the very same nation that in 1938 could not find it in its heart to admit 936 passengers on the ill-fated St. Louis. American Jews woke up to the reality of impotence and determined never again would we find ourselves politically weak and disconnected. And look how far we've come since then. And European Jewry, well, those of you who've traveled now not just to Western Europe, but to Central and Eastern Europe, see the enduring, tenacious quality of the Jewish people ready and determined to rebuild, including the remarkably inspiring stories of the double victims of the 20th century, the victims of Nazism and then communism, the Jews of the Czech Republic and Poland and Bulgaria and Romania and the Soviet Union and other nations, and how inspiring to see today, after all they've been through, this determination to affirm proudly their Jewish identity and, yes, their connection to world Jewry and to the state of Israel. So, my friends, old friends and new friends, when we talk about today, we were not dropped by parachute. We've come from somewhere, and in each of us there are unhealed scars and there is eternal pain, but there must also be fortitude and strength and, yes, pride. So we'll face the issues together smartly, and we'll get through them, and there will be a tomorrow. The main issue, and you've heard it from Candy and others who spoke, is what happens in the course of the next week and 2 weeks, again, not far from Greenwich. The Palestinians, I'm sorry to say, not for the first time, are once again about to shoot themselves in the foot. Given a choice between negotiating with an Israel that has said repeatedly, under consecutive prime ministers over the past decade, we accept a two-state solution. We are ready without condition to sit and negotiate. We understand that painful compromise on our part will be a result, but there is no other alternative for the children of both your and our societies. The Palestinian leadership has decided once again to spurn that opportunity and instead to do an end run, to go to the United Nations. And what they will find is that their strategy will prove counterproductive and move us further away, not closer to peace. What a tragedy. What's likely to happen? Well, we don't yet have the full script because the Palestinians are still debating among themselves and engaging in that perennial game called brinkmanship. But nonetheless, they have a couple of choices. One, they can seek to go to the Security Council and begin a process that would lead to full membership in the United Nations as the State of Palestine. They would become then the 194th member of the UN, following South Sudan, which joined this summer and which, by the way, almost immediately recognized the State of Israel and established diplomatic ties. How do the Palestinians achieve that goal, if indeed that is their goal? Well, they initiate it by writing to the Secretary General of the United Nations requesting membership. He, in turn, is required to forward that letter to the Security Council. The Security Council will consider it. It may take a day, it could take a week, it could take a month. But here's the point. Unless the Security Council approves the recommendation, it stops dead in its tracks. And guess what? It will not approve the Palestinian quest. And in Ramallah, they know it. I'm not telling them anything through this live webcast that they don't already know. Why will it not go through? Well, the simple answer is because the United States has said, to its credit, that it will veto. The United States has said the only way to achieve a two-state settlement that creates a state of Palestine living alongside the state of Israel is through direct face-to-face negotiations, and the U.S. will not be a party to any such end run. But they may go anyway because they may wish to embarrass the United States by cornering us, exposing us as such a friend of Israel that we would reject Palestinian aspirations. But you know what? They may have a surprise in store for them. Because the United States may not be alone in denying the Palestinians what they seek at the Security Council. There are several member nations on that roster of 15 who also understand that this is not a good idea. And we have spoken with them, and others have spoken with them, and will be speaking with them again and again as well. And if 7 nations do not support the Palestinian aspiration at the Security Council, whether they abstain or vote no, it's finished. And then, of course, the United States would not have been alone. It would have been joined by other nations. So if you look at the roster of the UN, you'll see that there are some countries that, no matter what we say or do, will robotically, reflexively, blindly support the Palestinians, but there are others who won't. And please keep a close eye on those who won't, because they, like the Czech Republic, need to be remembered. So if the Palestinian aspirations are blocked at the Security Council, what's left to them? Well, then they go to the General Assembly with a resolution, a different kind of resolution that falls short of asking for full membership, because the General Assembly cannot bypass the Security Council. So in all likelihood, and again, the final text of that resolution has not yet been completed, the resolution could say, we, the United Nations General Assembly, support the upgrade of Palestine to a non-permanent observer state at the United Nations. And what's the key word in that phrase? State. State. It would mean that a majority of the General Assembly has recognized Palestine as a state through the world body. And if that resolution also says, and that state's borders are the borders of June 4th, 1967, including the capital of that state, Eastern Jerusalem, then you have this validation by the General Assembly of that state, even if it has no juridical power per se. But it's not just symbols we're toying with here. Because if you remember that rather regrettable op-ed by Mahmoud Abbas in the New York Times some months ago, he spelled out their strategy. He wants this status because it will upgrade the Palestinians throughout the agencies of the UN, including especially the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And the purpose of that is to allow the Palestinians to become a party that can file complaints against the State of Israel based on the General Assembly recognition of the State of Palestine, meaning that 500,000 Israelis are occupying the State of Palestine and should become the object of legal procedures that could include an array of mechanisms. And there's more. So what happens next week and the weeks that follow as this drama unfolds not far from here is critically important. Now, I've hedged my words because it's not entirely clear that there will be a resolution. There's likely to be a resolution, and if I were a betting man, I'd bet there will be. But at the same time, there is a group of people led by Tony Blair, Catherine Ashton from the European Union, U.S. negotiators like David Hale and Dennis Ross, and others, who are still actively seeking an alternative strategy which would convince the world and the parties themselves that there's a better way. So we need to keep that as a possibility. Now, you may ask, well, if at the Security Council we might muster a group to block them, could we do the same at the General Assembly if they went ahead? And the answer is no. Why? And here is UN Diplomacy 101, I'm sorry to say. By the way, let me add, it's not the UN that's our target here. The UN is like Madison Square Garden. If you like the Knicks and the Knicks lose, you don't blame Madison Square Garden. The UN is no more or less than the sum total of its member states. In 1947, those member states adopted Resolution 181 that created the two-state solution. The UN has changed, and the 193 member states today reflect a remarkably different world than 1947. So how would it work in the General Assembly? And here's what we're up against. The Palestinians write a resolution, whatever it is, and they go first to the Arab League. The Arab League are 22 member states of the UN. Now, they themselves are not monolithic. Morocco and Jordan are on the moderate end of the spectrum, but you have Sudan and Syria and others on the other end of the spectrum. But after all, at the end of the day, they will do the Palestinians' bidding, and presto, you have a block of 22. Next, they will go to the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the OIC, 56 members of the UN, including some overlap with the Arabs. But with perhaps a rare exception, a country like Albania possibly, those 56 nations will rubber stamp what the Arab League already endorsed. And it doesn't end there. And then they go to the non-aligned movement with 118 member states, as I recall. And most of those states overlap with the Muslim nations and the Arab nations and their buddies like Venezuela and Bolivia and Nicaragua and Cuba and North Korea. And again, with a few exceptions, countries like Singapore are exceptions. Presto, you have about 115. And then you have a few fellow travelers who are not in any of those groups. At this point, countries, I'm sorry to say, like Brazil, a critically important country that will support the Palestinians. Or Russia. The Russian ambassador to the UN, Churkin, said the other day, we will support whatever the Palestinians want. And so you will have an automatic majority. In fact, I can tell you that if the Palestinians wrote a resolution saying that the moon is made of green cheese and they wanted it adopted, it would be adopted. So, what's our strategy? Ours, the American strategy, ours, the Israeli strategy, ours, AJC's strategy, ours, the strategy of friends like Italy and the Netherlands and the Czech Republic and Germany, which also have come out against this Palestinian strategy. Our strategy is to deny them the qualitative majority they seek. And who, above all, do they want the hechsher of? The European Union. Because the European Union is seen in the UN as the center of moral gravity. And if they have the validation of the European Union, then in their own eyes, it's a true majority. And if they don't, then they know full well that it's not going to sell in the important places to have won this on the wings of Venezuela, Bolivia, Pakistan, Cuba, North Korea, Zimbabwe, Sudan, and the like. So as we meet, and for weeks and months before and since, the battleground has been in Brussels and the 27 capitals of Europe, and ever mindful that there are another roughly 20, call them EU wannabes. Countries on the periphery that want to behave well, to be noticed by the EU as eventual members of the EU, and certain other countries elsewhere that defer to the EU's expertise on Middle East issues. So when the Czech Republic punches above its weight and says no, by the way, not just to Palestinian unilateralism, but says no to an EU consensus that would support it, you have a major development. And when, as I said, Italy and Germany and the Netherlands and Romania join with the Czech Republic, they are telling the EU, you will not get the common foreign policy that you seek, and they are encouraging other nations to join with them. And until the very day of the vote, should it take place, I can tell you that AJC, which, as you heard earlier, has met with all 27 EU states, will have probably done so at least another 2 or 3 times. That's the main battleground. But you know, there's still a day after, and we can't forget that. And the point we are making to each country we meet, and as you heard from Candy and from Beverly, AJC alone, this global NGO, will have in the next few weeks another 100 or so meetings with world leaders. We will have met with close to 400 world leaders since mid-May. It's a kind of unprecedented diplomatic effort by an NGO, Jewish or non-Jewish, recognizing the stakes. And what's our message? And what should your message be should you have an opportunity to speak with people of influence? Our message should be yes to peace. Yes to peace. No to Palestinian unilateralism. And as a senior American official told me this morning at a private breakfast, the American message to the countries they're targeting and we're targeting is very crystal clear. You vote in the General Assembly, you own your vote. You cannot later walk away from your vote. And understand what your vote could do. It could move the peace process still further down the road. It could trigger unrealistic expectations on the part of the Palestinian people, turning into unrest and possibly violence when they're not materialized. You're pouring oil on fire in a region where today the extremists operating in a number of countries in the so-called Arab Spring will seize on this issue, not to mention what Turkey might do with it. So you own your vote. You know, so often at the UN there are these battery of resolutions against Israel. You may or may not even know about them. There are literally 20 each General Assembly session. And robotically, most of the nations of the world support those resolutions. And some may think that this is just another one, and it will be forgotten. And just as most of you probably don't know who voted for and against each of those 20 resolutions, you'll never know who voted for or against. Well, we're telling them, this one's different. We will remember. I can tell you today, by heart, the 1947 vote on the partition, Resolution 181. I can tell you by heart those countries who voted for and against Resolution 3379, the General Assembly resolution of 1975 that equated Zionism with racism. And this is a similar resolution. This is one we will not forget, and we will not allow others to forget either. They're going to own their vote. And you, I hope, will pay close attention, as we will, if and when that vote takes place. And in the midst of all that, I come back to the Durban process. On September 22nd, a week from today, the nations of the world will gather to commemorate, that's their word, the World Conference on Racism of September 2001, just days before 9/11, that was billed as a noble struggle against racism, an effort we should all support, and instead was hijacked by a group of countries and NGOs that turned it into literally an anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic hate fest, prompting countries like the United States, and I had been invited to be a member of the official U.S. delegation with Colin Powell, to leave. In 2009, 8 years later, that process produced a review conference of all that had transpired since that glorious day in Durban, and that was held in Geneva. 10 countries stayed away, including the Czech Republic. And I can tell you by memory the other 9 as well, because that was another one of those litmus tests of countries that have principle and spine and backbone and won't be bullied by the herd mentality and the go-along, get-along notion that is often too prevalent in international organizations. If I scratch your back, you scratch mine, I'll get that committee assignment, and I'll give you this committee assignment. Those 10 countries said no, and a number of us from AJC were present to witness what took place. The opening day of that Durban conference was Yom HaShoah, and the opening speaker was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. I kid you not, the president of Iran. To their credit, another 30 nations or so walked out as he spoke. But they returned to the hall later. And the majority of nations not only did not walk out, but they stayed and they applauded and they admired the words of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, synonymous with an individual who has trampled on human rights, helped rig elections, denies there are any gays in his country, and flaunts the resolutions of the UN Security Council on Iran's nuclear program. And that's going to be the headline speaker again this year. To date, there are 11, perhaps 12 countries that have said no to this exercise, including, laudably, the United States. And I want to say a special word about Canada, because even before the United States pulled out, Canada was the first nation in the world to pull out of the Durban conference here in New York. And Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada, has been about as good a friend as you'll find on this planet when it comes to standing with Israel and the Jewish people. And I say that as a non-Canadian, non-partisan activist. But to show you how the UN works, when Canada ran for a Security Council seat last year, it was defeated. Now, normally everyone loves Canada. It's like Raymond. Who doesn't like Canada? It's a wonderful country. But it was defeated. Why? Because, as Stephen Harper said afterwards, our support for Israel. That's the way it can work. So we have the Durban conference next week. We hope that the 11 or possibly 12 countries, when I say possibly, it's because we heard a report as I left AJC that a 12th country had pulled out, but we don't yet have verification. We'll hope to have it tonight or tomorrow morning, and we hope others will follow. So that's what we're facing. And then beyond that, of course, we're facing the challenges of Turkey. And here, let me just say a word. I don't want to go through an analysis of each of the countries in the region. If you would like me to in questions, I'm happy to respond. You know the basic tableau, and whatever I say today will or will not be applicable tomorrow and the day after. We can just give it a collective oi. But one thing here about Turkey. Please don't fall into the trap of believing that this story began on May 31st, 2010 on the high seas. This story began before. In fact, there are a few of you in this audience, including my college friend, Marvin Israelo, active in AJC in Westchester and nationally, who traveled with us to Ankara in 2003 to meet Prime Minister Erdogan shortly after he took office. And I'm not exaggerating. When all of us left that 90-minute meeting with Prime Minister Erdogan, and we got together and debriefed with each other, to a person, everyone said, "This is not our friend. This is not our friend." And subsequent events over time have borne that out in spades. So yes, there was a regrettable incident on the high seas, and for once the UN actually provided a pretty fair report called the Palmer Report. So fair, in fact, that Turkey rejected it. Imagine, Israel actually accepted it, and Turkey flatly rejected it. So we have our challenges with Turkey, which, so it seems, wishes to reestablish its ascendancy in the region. It'll be interesting to see whether the Arab world is ready to see Turkish reascendancy. Time will tell. We have the so-called Arab Spring, and I'm not being a smart aleck after the fact. I never understood the use of the word spring. I fully understand, as you do, that these were dramatic, historic events, absolutely. And like you, I fully shared the hope that they might lead in the direction of Europe and North America. And like you, I wanted to believe the people in Tahrir Square included their Bob Dylans and their Joan Baez's. But you know, there was something inside me that said, slow down, David. It's not so simple. Don't fall into this binary reporting of the media. The binary reporting that eventually determined that Mubarak, who had been our friend for 30 years, was no longer our friend, was cast as the bad guy, which meant that anyone who was anti-Mubarak by definition in the media's binary mind became a good guy. Well, sure, you could oppose Mubarak and be a good guy, but not necessarily. And only later did people wake up and say, wait a second, we're pushing for elections, but who are the best organized people in Egypt for early elections? They're not the Bob Dylans and Joan Baez's of Egypt. They're still strumming their guitar on Tahrir Square. It's the Muslim Brotherhood. Gee, why didn't we think about that earlier before pushing for early elections? And did you happen to see the front page of the New York Times today? Having been told for a while that things were going swimmingly in Libya, as we look to oust Gaddafi and the thugs that supported him and the murderers that defended him, suddenly, out of the blue, it seems, we're told that the Islamists may hold sway. That's today's New York Times headline. Well, forgive me, where were they yesterday? And the day before? And the day before? Why is it only now, as Gaddafi seems to have been defeated, that we're told it may not be so simple, folks? Fasten your seatbelts. So I'm hesitant, and I think others should have the humility as well to come before audiences like yours with the certitude of the cable news experts and tell you what's going to happen tomorrow in Turkey and in Egypt and in Syria and in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain and perhaps, heaven forbid, in Jordan. All we know is that for now, the deck is stacked against Israel and things look pretty challenging. But I want to finish in a different direction. I want to finish by talking about us. Because the easiest thing for a speaker and an audience to do, I believe, is for the speaker to share whatever knowledge he has, for the audience to receive it, for both of us to go home, and to continue on our own respective paths in the days to come. And I think for me that would be a calamity. This is precisely a moment in history, I believe, when each of us needs to look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, how do we relate to all of these unfolding events? Is it simply as reader of the media, as observer? Is it simply to offer comments to each other when we gather for dinner? Or is there something more we can and should and must do? And that's why in my weekly blog for the Huffington Post and Jerusalem Post, the piece I wrote this week was called Hineni. Here I am. And if we were an evangelical service and I were a different kind of preacher, I would be grabbing this microphone and walking through the aisles, and I'd be asking my brothers and sisters to stand with me and say, Hineni, here I am, and I'm on board, and I'm on the team, and I'm going to stand up, and I'm going to fight in whatever way I know how, because what's happening in all of these situations affects me personally. And I'm not going to allow myself one day to be the object of a history that asks, where were American Jews when the ship, the St. Louis, was off the coast of Florida? Or when throughout the 1930s, even the limited German immigration quota of this country went unfilled each and every year, because to fill them would have meant to fill them with Jews. So I'm here, and many of you whom I know are no less active in so many different ways, to say Hineni, and to ask each of you who also by being here has said Hineni, to turn around and ask members of your family and friends and colleagues and neighbors to understand that this is one of those moments when not only should we remember who voted with the Czech Republic, but who stood up right here in Greenwich, and who stood up in White Plains, and in Stamford, and in Chappaqua, and in Harrison, and everywhere else from this point forward. And what does that mean? It means for me that we stand together, we join in organizations. None of us alone can reach world leaders. Together we can, and we have, and we will. Our job, your job and my job, is to ensure that whoever sits in the Oval Office, whoever runs the House, whoever runs the Senate, recognizes and understands and supports the unique U.S.-Israel partnership as being not a gift to Israel, but as being in the mutual self-interest of both democratic nations. No one else can do that job. No one other than the 400 people in this sanctuary and the people watching this on the webcast and the people who are in other circles surrounding us. And thirdly, there's another big thing we can do in addition to whatever each of us does as individuals and traveling to Israel and, yes, traveling to the Czech Republic and buying Israeli products and buying Czech products and buying Canadian products and vacationing in those countries. The big thing, and with this I end, you're going to have a Senate race in Connecticut, I'm told. Well, if I were running for the Senate, or if I were running for the presidency, here's what I would tell you. In 1973, there was a shot across the bow of this country. It came in the form of the Arab members of OPEC that inflicted on us a punishing embargo because of this country's support for Israel. And to the credit of the United States, we did not back off in that support. But you know what happened then? The President of the United States, Richard Nixon, and those who followed him, Democrats and Republicans alike, looked us in the eye and said to us, we will wean ourselves from our addiction to oil from hostile countries, and we will achieve energy independence, and we will regain our national security. In 1973, we imported 1/3 of our oil needs. After all of those presidents made all of those declarations, as we meet here today, our nation imports nearly 2/3 of our oil needs. The good news is that some of it comes from Canada and Mexico and other friendly nations, and some of it doesn't. But close your eyes for a moment and imagine, what would Iran look like if it were not able to get $100 for a barrel of oil? What would it look like if we lived in a post-fossil fuel world? What would it look like if in the meantime we could reduce demand by buying more fuel-efficient vehicles, which are increasingly on the market, and by the way, in Europe, they're way ahead of us. You think a Prius is good? Try and I'm doing a lot of work for the Czech Republic. The Skoda and the Audi have diesels that get 65 to 70 miles per gallon, and they're clean fuel. So I'm not even speaking about high-speed trains and all the rest of the infrastructure. And you know, the easy thing would be to blame the presidents. But I blame us. I blame us because the presidents never believed that we were serious, and they were afraid of us. Remember Jimmy Carter? I know you remember Jimmy Carter. But you remember Jimmy Carter when he tried to tell us to put on a sweater in winter and turn down the thermostat? Remember that? And how did the nation respond? It laughed at him. It laughed at him. It ridiculed him. He looked weak. He looked meek. That's not the America we are entitled to. We're a muscular America. No one is going to tell us what I can drive. But we're paying a price. And the price may be Iran's nuclear program. And the price may be Venezuela's belligerence and its alliance with Iran. And the price may be that the Saudis, through their foundations and so forth, have been funding Salafi and Wahhabi madrasas around the world that teach jihad and martyrdom. So we're paying a price. And we need politicians who hear from us that we're fed up. And we don't simply want their words, because right now, those countries have us, forgive me, over a barrel. It's time to turn the tables. And who can do it? You can do it. We can do it. AJC can do it, but only if it becomes part of a mass movement. So there's a lot we can do. There's a great deal we can do, because we're here to stay. We'll make it through these turbulent, tumultuous, dangerous, unpredictable times. Anyone who's been to Israel in recent weeks or months knows this is not a country about to shudder in fear. It's a vibrant, resilient, strong, proud country, and so are we. So are we. So to you I say, Hineni, and thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. Our first question is, would a resolution in favor of a Palestinian state change the status of Palestinian refugees?
Well, I'm going to try and give you short answers, having given you a long... The answer is it's an interesting question. And the obvious answer should be yes, it should change the status. After all, if the Palestinians have declared a state, then why should there be a refugee problem? But then again, think of this. There are still refugee camps in Gaza. Why are there Palestinian refugee camps in Gaza if Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005 and declared that it has no territorial interest whatsoever in Gaza? Why are there refugee camps? Why aren't these people out of refugee camps and put into permanent housing and integrated? And the answer, I think, is known to you as it's known to me. These Palestinian refugees for 4 generations have been used, tragically, as tools, as props, to keep the Palestinian claim alive. And I suspect that because many of the refugees assert that their grandparents came from Haifa and Jaffa, unless and until those areas are made available, they will continue to maintain the camps. And unfortunately, the international community goes along with it and does a disservice to the Palestinian people.
What ramifications could the Palestinian-U.S. push have on other situations in the world, like the Kurdish region?
Okay. Well, thank you, John from Wisconsin. You know, again, it's an interesting question because, in theory, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If this goes through, this gambit of the Palestinians, if I were a Kurd, if I were a Chechen, if I were a Catalan, well, you can keep going down the list. I would say, hey, this is pretty interesting. If the Palestinians can get away with this, why can't I? Why can't I declare a freedom movement? After all, I want independence for my Kurds. I want independence for my Chechens or my Tibetans or my Kashmiris. So I'm going to follow the path of the Palestinians. The point, though, is that the countries most affected, countries like Russia, for example, or China, know that their size and their strength and their weight in the UN will ensure that it will never come even close to discussion. Israel is in a different category than they are. So, great question. Watch other movements to see if they try to follow, but I wouldn't expect a whole lot of effort on the part of the UN to be responsive. The Palestinians have, in a way, become the poster children for much of the UN system, and I could spend another hour, I promise you I won't, talking to you about how the UN system treats the Palestinians differently than every other refugee group in the world. Just one example. Some of you have heard of UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Well, that's the body that deals with refugees from conflict. And at any given time, they're dealing with literally millions of people from conflict. But they don't deal with Palestinians, because some 60 years ago, the UN set up UNRWA. And that was solely and exclusively for Palestinians. And they made 2 distinctions between UNRWA and UNHCR. The Palestinians were defined as refugees indefinitely into the future, meaning that anyone born to a refugee by definition was a refugee. Number one. And number two, the UN said the goal of UNRWA is not resettlement. The goal of UNHCR is resettlement. If I'm a refugee from conflict in Sudan, UNHCR takes my case and tries to find me a home in Australia or Canada or France or Britain or the United States so I can start a new life. How many of you in this audience come from refugee families? Well, then you know. You resettle in another land, your children are not considered refugees, but in the case of the UN, Palestinians are given this unique status. So the Palestinian refugees that were asked about a moment ago could be Palestinian refugees for the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, all of which, by the way, is paid for by the international community, led by the United States. And guess who pays the least amount of support for the Palestinian refugees? The Arab nations.
Okay, this is going to be a 2-for-1. I'm going to give you two questions I think are related.
And maybe we'll wrap it up.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit more about what things may look like for Israel the day after, weeks after, months after the UDI is passed, assuming that it is passed, and you indicated before that's not necessarily
It's probable,
the
but
case,
not certain.
probable. Okay, absent a miracle. And the second question is, would you please comment on the statement today by the Palestinian representative to the UN that there will be no Jews allowed in Palestine?
Right, okay, great, thank you. Great questions. So from right to left. The statement, I don't know if you saw it, is contemptible. The thing is, where's the anger? Where's the anger of the international community? I mean, here's the Palestinian ambassador to the UN on the eve of their unveiling of statehood or whatever will happen. And in the next breath, he says, it's in the best interest to separate the populations, which means a Judenrein state of Palestine. Now, mind you, if the Israelis took the same logic as the Palestinian ambassador to the UN, what would they say? Well, fine, we'll reciprocate. And the world would be horrified at the, the world would be horrified at the very notion that Israel might seek to expel its Arab minority. And yet, once again, there's what I call the infantilization of the Palestinian people. This kind of lowered expectations, which infantilizes them. It does them no service. It does them no good. If they're moving towards statehood, whether next week or down the road, they need to understand what sovereign responsibility means, like other nations do. And it's time to elevate, not lower the expectations. So, if I were a Palestinian, you know what I would say? I want Jews in Palestine. And you know why I want Jews in Palestine? I may love them, I may not even know them. Here's why I want Jews in Palestine. Because it will be the litmus test for me as a Palestinian to show myself and the world that the state of Palestine can become a mature nation. And how do you measure a mature nation? Well, one way is by how it treats its minorities. Israel is treated as it should be, in part by how it treats its minorities. America is measured in part by how we treat our minorities. And I, as a Palestinian, would want to show the world that we can do something different. But alas, the state of Palestine might become just another Arab state that is Judenrein. And my wife, who's not here tonight because our marriage is strong since she doesn't hear me speak, she says, comes from Libya. When the Jews of Libya were expelled in 1967, just after the Six-Day War, and don't trust me, go and Google it, there was no UN resolution. There was no New York Times editorial. There was barely a line of news reporting that a Jewish community of nearly 2,000 years had come to a complete and total end. Now, I don't say this because of my wife's need for some kind of vanity or recognition. I say it because if the world had understood the implications in 1967 of a Libyan regime that could not even abide the remaining 4,000 to 5,000 Jews in a country of several million people, what did it say about what that country would become? And that's why, for me, you want to test for Egypt? There are no Jews left. I'll give you a test: the Coptic Christians. You want a test of whether Egypt eventually goes in the right direction or the wrong direction? Sure, there are many ways to measure it. But one way that we in this sanctuary should be especially sensitive to, since all the Jews were expelled, how will they treat their Coptic Christians? If they treat them well, if they afford them equal protection, equal opportunity under the law, then perhaps Egypt is going in the right direction. And here then I'll add a third word to the vocabulary, but an Arabic word, inshallah.
Has Israel ever taken the PA to the International Criminal Court for rocket attacks, Gilad Shalit, etc.? Could they, if PA's status
This is a great question.
is upgraded?
This is up.
And the other direction.
I gotta hold on to this.
Okay. The other direction in the what if Israel did something differently is, what, if anything, would you suggest that Israel might do differently to facilitate the peace process?
Okay. You know, if the Palestinians succeed with their General Assembly gambit and gain access to the International Criminal Court as a state, then that means they also have to exercise the responsibilities of statehood, whether they choose to or not. And by the way, what exactly would be the borders of that state? You know, it's interesting. No one talks about Hamas in all of this. You know, it's that 800-pound elephant that's somehow invisible in every room. Is the Palestinian Authority purporting to represent Hamas and therefore Gaza? Is it purporting to represent only itself and the West Bank? Not clear. But on the assumption that it purports to represent the Palestinian people, well, Gilad Shalit becomes a reason for Israel to go to the ICC and file its own complaint against what is now a state party and say that state party is responsible for the kidnapping across an international border of a young Israeli who has now been in captivity for more than 1,900 days, and notwithstanding the Geneva Conventions, has had no visit whatsoever from the International Red Cross. Moreover, that state has allowed mortars and missiles and rockets to be fired from their territory to our territory for the deliberate purpose of terrorizing and killing Israeli citizens. So what I said earlier, what's sauce for the goose can be sauce for the gander, means that Israel might wish to consider its own response at the ICC. And finally, the last question, what, if anything, would you suggest Israel might do differently to facilitate the peace process? I'm sure there are many things that Israel can do, and if we devoted the time, my guess is there's more than one opinion here about what Israel can do. But here, let me, because it's late, and I'm going to be totally honest with you. Not that I wasn't before, but even more so. You know, there are all of these people, and there was a recent piece in the New York Times that said, I call it the IOI syndrome, the if only Israel syndrome. You know, there's this notion that if only Israel had a different government, if only Israel had a different tone to its public utterances, if only Israel took a less aggressive stand towards its dangerous neighbors, if only Israel didn't have settlements, if only Israel didn't have settlers, if only Israel didn't have a right wing. And the assumption is then there would be peace. Now, the truth of the matter is, if that were the case, to me it's a worthwhile price. But I don't buy it. That doesn't mean, please understand me, it doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have responsibilities in the peace process. Of course it does. Of course it does. And it doesn't mean that Israel wouldn't pay a very high price for any eventual agreement. It would have to come to grips domestically to agree on the price. And it would be painful. But this if only Israel syndrome is a kind of uniquely Jewish pathology. Because to me what it does is, essentially it says, the solution is in our hand because the problem was of our creation. And Americans want to believe at the very least that every problem has a solution. But what should the Palestinians do to achieve peace? Because, you know what? If we had a left-of-center government in Israel, well, wait a second. We did. We did. His name was Ehud Barak. His foreign minister was Shlomo Ben Ami. It was the most left-of-center government in Israel's history. It worked with Bill Clinton at Camp David for a sweeping two-state solution. And what was Arafat's response? Followed by the Second Intifada. I mean, think about this for a moment. I mean, it's so counterintuitive. Here are Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak, two people genuinely committed to the search for peace, struggling to persuade the Palestinians to accept a two-state agreement. And the response is not only a no with no counteroffer, but a second intifada that killed well over 1,000 Israelis, which in American proportional terms would be as many as 40,000? I mean, is that, forgive me, is that an appropriate response? And the IOI crowd would say, well, but maybe we needed a more left-wing leader. Well, how about in 1996 when Shimon Peres succeeded the assassinated Yitzhak Rabin? He should have been a shoo-in for re-election in 96. And what happened? You remember? You said it. One of several bus incidents. Dozens of people killed on Shimon Peres's watch. Now, again, I want to stress, it's not that I don't think Israel has responsibilities. It's not that I think settlements are helpful, especially when the footprint is large. It's not that I think outposts are helpful. I don't. But I think we need some clarity here. Shimon Peres was the prime minister of Israel. Terror attacks. Ehud Barak was the prime minister of Israel with Bill Clinton as his partner. The Second Intifada. Ehud Olmert moved from the right to the center, went beyond Barak's proposal in 2008, and what did he get? Rejection. So we need to look a little more deeper at what's going on the other side, and forgive me, not succumb to the New York Times editorial mentality or the Financial Times editorial mentality, which makes it all so simple. God, they think it's all so simple. Why are we so stupid not to see what they see? It's the IOI stupid. It's the if only Israel stupid. Well, forgive me. You heard before that nice things about me. I must be stupid. I must be stupid. Or, heaven forbid, I must not want peace. Well, let me tell you something. It's not for me to demonstrate my priest credentials to you, but I'm part of a people who in sanctuaries like this repeat the words, Lo yisagoy el goy cherev, lo yilmadu od milchama. And nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor shall they learn war anymore. I don't need the New York Times. I don't need the Financial Times. I don't need the smart Alex on television to tell me the desirability of peace. For 3,000 and more years, the Jewish people have made it our central quest to be pursuers of peace. What we need are partners for peace. And the day we have partners for peace, peace will not just be an option, peace will be an outcome. And then maybe the lion will lie down with the lamb. That's my tradition. That's your tradition. Shana Tova, and thank you.